Good evening, everybody. Welcome to Thursday night Bible study. Deep calls to deep here at Friendship Bible Church. I'm D.G. Farmer, and we are studying through the book of Judges. Tonight we are going to do Judges chapter 19. Now, before we begin tonight, let's go to the Lord in prayer and ask for His blessing for tonight's study. Hi, Joan. Good to see you. Right in the back by the chair, right next to Ro. Can you get Harry, Joan? Harry's going to give you some notes.
He's going to give you what?
Notes.
Am I in your way?
Oh, good. Good to see you. Okay, let's go to the Lord in prayer and ask for His blessing for tonight's study. Dear Heavenly Father, this has been a great study, and it's been a wonderful book, and you've taught us so much, and how you interact with your people, and what you have for us as we look at a time period that seems so foreign to us, and yet there's so many applications, Lord. And we just thank you for the blessing of your word. Thank you for the ability to come every Thursday night and study. Thank you for the hearts and minds who show up here at church and online at home, and just come out just to study your word and just sit with you, Lord, and learn much more about you and how you interact with your people. And just been such a blessing, this study. So, Lord, I pray tonight again you open up the hearts and mind of everybody tonight as we look at your word, Judges chapter 19. Bless the study tonight. Pray all this in Jesus' name. Amen. Okay, Judges chapter 19, moving right along. As everybody can see, I have my stool tonight. Last week I was in a panic. The stool was missing. So I wanted to thank Chris Leap personally. So good. Chris Leap had it. So what you might not know is every week I taught, I thought this is the week where the stool was going to collapse and I was going to fall on camera. So it went missing and I went into a panic last week, and Chris took it and fixed it. So there's not even a wobble. So there's no chance of me falling anymore. So the thrill is gone. Thank you, Chris. So tonight is chapter 19. Next week is chapter 20. The following week is chapter 21, and then we are done our study. So after this week, we have 2 more weeks. Then Pastor George is going to take over. He's going to do 1st and 2nd Peter. It's been a while personally since I've studied those 2 books. It's going to be a blessing. Pastor George is a wonderful Bible teacher, and I'm looking forward to his study. So that's going to be next. While that goes on, I'm going to poll people to see what book they want me to do next, so I haven't really decided where we're going to go after 1st and 2nd Peter. Revelation, Acts, and Nehemiah are some of the books that have been suggested, but we'll see. So I'm going to poll everyone, and then consensus, whatever the consensus is, that's the next book. So anyway, so that'll be coming next, all right? I'll take care of that for you later. I'll hole punch it for her so she can get it into her. Okay, Judges chapter 19. Moving right along. So last week we finished the first story of the appendix. Okay? We talked about the appendix. The appendix is the last 5 chapters of the book of Judges. And it consists of 2 stories. Okay? There's 2 stories that were added by the author to show just how apostate and wayward the children of Israel had become not long after the death of Joshua. And so we had the first story last week in 17 and 18. We finished that up. And tonight we start the second part of the appendix, the second story. So these were added. They're not in chronological order. So this occurs generally, the appendix, during the first part, very, very early on in the book of Judges. And one of the themes here and the reasons for the appendix here is that the children of Israel, they needed a king and a strong leader. And without one, this era is characterized by lawlessness, or an every man or tribe doing only what was right in their own eyes type of attitude. The author is showing us that the conduct of the Danites in chapter 19 represented all that was what was wrong with Israel at this time. Dan was the poster child of bad behavior. And for those of us who are just joining us this week, chapter 18 was about the tribe of Dan. And so Dan is being raised up, showing just the type of apostate behavior was going on during the time. They were the poster child. They never conquered their allotted territory except for the two cities of Zorah and Eshtal. They never took hold of or stood on the promise that God would give them the victory despite long odds and adverse military difficulties. Conquering their territory was difficult. It was not easy. Looking at it on a human level, sometimes it may appear to them as impossible. But they had the promises of God. They never stood on those promises. It's a great example for us. Now, in the end, they didn't possess enough faith or trust in Jehovah to look past what their eyes could see. Another thing that we do constantly in our lives, without even meaning to. We see a situation, we use our eyes, the situation seems impossible. And when we use our eyes in that manner and we don't see the strength of our God, sometimes we can get caught up in some bad decisions. So what did they do? They just simply gave up and decided to try to find another area for a possession. The problem was that their behavior was one of spiritual immaturity and disobedience. See, we can look at Dan's behavior and really focus on the fact that they were basically immature. But understand that they were disobedient as well. They were disobeying God when they did not take a hold of the land that they were allotted. Yet they acted, if you noticed last week, throughout the entire chapter as if they were being blessed by God. Their attitude was that certainly God was behind all their good fortune. They found a perfect spot to the north that was lush and well-watered. Not only that, but the people in the city of Laish had no protection from a king or a treaty with one, which more or less left them defenseless. It would be very easy to take this city instead of battling these fierce Amorites that kept pestering them and that gave them all kinds of problems. The author is also making a connection between the 5 spies in chapter 19 and the 12 spies at the time of Moses. See, in Numbers 13, 10 spies came back after looking at the land, and they gave a bad report, claiming that the Canaanites were simply too big and too strong to conquer. If you remember the story. They used their eyes. We're like locusts in their sight. We're too small. There's no way we can defeat them. Now, 2 spies, Joshua and Caleb, came back and claimed that God would give them the victory no matter how big and strong these Canaanites were. Faith, not sight. Compared those to the 5 Danite spies who gave a good report. But notice last week, they didn't give a good report because they had faith. Not because God would grant them the victory as he promised. That's not why. But because the people of Laish were easy pickings. That's why they were so confident. Now, the cherry on top of this good fortune that they were having in this chapter was that the 5 spies last week found a way to secure a Levite to serve them as a high priest along with a host of startup idols and religious items for worship in their new city. They hit the jackpot. But what was the reason for Jonathan being at Micah's house in the first place? Bible.org put it this way. The Levites suffered from unemployment, and thus they traveled about the nation seeking a roof over their heads and food on their table. The young Levite in our text had not found a place in Bethlehem. We mentioned he stayed for a time, but it wasn't permanent. and he had made his way to the hill country of Ephraim, where he encountered Micah's bed and breakfast. Furthermore, what respectable, God-loving tribe would dare open a place of worship without teraphim, graven images, molten images, and an ephod for their priest? No good Israelite would start a place up like that without securing all these items. The fact that they had to steal these items was not a problem, since God had been giving them his stamp of approval from the beginning. No worries, a little thievery is okay. Because obviously God was with them. Their good fortune here. Great city and a bunch of idols that they can fill their worship center with. And a priest, a Levite to boot. The fact that they had this, The evidence of God's approval exists in the obvious way in which things have become much easier for them once they decided to put those devilish Amorites in their rearview mirror. Never mind God's words or promises, since they only take one so far. It would appear that the success of the Danites was sure proof that God was with them. And I tried to take your words, Pastor George, but I could not remember. I can't remember what you said out by the car. I don't know if you remember, but we were talking about how things were going so well for them, right? That they just took it as God's blessing, right? But you, the easy way, the easy way is always God's blessing, right? That's how we know God's will. It's always the easy way. Yeah, I loved how you put it. I couldn't remember, or I would have quoted you. They took the city easily and renamed it Dan, then proceeded to build their place of worship, all with little or no resistance. But all of this came at a cost. They were the least successful tribe out of the 12 in taking their territory. So basically, they lost their God-given inheritance and the blessings that would have followed. The Danites would never know how God may have blessed them if they obeyed. We will never know, or can only guess at the blessings God was ready to bless them with in their own land, in the territory given to them. We'll never know. They also lost their God, as they would slip into gross idolatry. Studying the history forward of the Danites. Gross idolatry in their history, moving forward after the move. Their worship was not just syncretistic, but they totally abandoned the worship of Jehovah altogether eventually. Dan became a major center for idolatry, lived like pagans. And it all started when they abandoned God's very words and promises. It is a warning to all, including us, about how important it is to hold God's word as the ultimate authority as a culture and as an individual. So, one of the main lessons from Dan and from chapter 18. They stepped away from God's word and God's truth. They didn't stand on the promises of God, and as a result, they lost their territory and they basically lost their God. Very sad story. Okay, well, let's begin tonight. Turn in your Bibles to chapter 19, Judges chapter 19. Now, I'm going to divide the chapter in half. So I'm going to read the first 15 verses, and then I'm going to read the last 15 verses, or 16 verses if we finish, right? No, we don't. Yeah, 15 and 15. I'll divide it right now. I may editorialize a little bit, which is a little bit different. Usually I read through, I don't say anything, but I may have a few editorial comments here. All right, so Judges chapter 19, let's follow along as I read the first 15 verses. Now, it came about in those days when there was no king in Israel. When there was no king in Israel. Got it? When there was no king in Israel. that there was a certain Levite staying in the remote part of the hill country of Ephraim, who took a concubine for himself from Bethlehem in Judah. But his concubine played the harlot against him, and she went away from him to her father's house in Bethlehem in Judah, and was there for a period of 4 months. Then her husband arose and went after her to speak tenderly to her in order to bring her back, taking with him his servant and a pair of donkeys. So she brought him into her father's house, apparently after he arrived, first thing she does. And when the girl's father saw him, he was glad to meet him. And his father-in-law, the girl's father, detained him, and he remained with him 3 days. So they ate and drank and lodged there. Now it came about on the 4th day that they got up early in the morning, and he prepared to go, and the girl's father said to his son-in-law, "Sustain yourself with a piece of bread, and afterward you may go." So both of them sat down and ate and drank together, and the girl's father said to him, "Please be willing to spend the night, and let your heart be merry." Basically detaining him another day. You don't need to go anywhere. We're having a good time here. Then the man arose to go, but his father-in-law urged him, so he spent the night there again. Now on the 5th day, he arose to go early in the morning, and the girl's father said, "Please sustain yourself and wait until the afternoon." So they both ate. And when the man arose to go, along with his concubine and servant, his father-in-law, the girl's father, said to him, "Behold now, the day is drawn to a close. Please spend the night. Lo, the day is coming to an end. Spend the night here, that your heart may be merry. Then tomorrow you may arise early for your journey, so that you may go home." But the man was not willing to spend the night. So he arose and departed, and came to a place opposite Jebus. Jebus. You say it, Jebus. Jebus. I don't know how you pronounce it. Jebus. That is Jerusalem. And there with him a pair of saddled donkeys. His concubine also was with him. And when they were near Jebus, the day was almost gone, and the servant said to his master, "Please come and let us turn aside into the city of the Jebusites and spend the night in it." However, his master said to him, "We will not turn aside into the city of foreigners who are not of the sons of Israel, but we will go to Gibeah, as far as Gibeah." And he said to his servant, "Come, let us approach one of these places, and we will spend the night in Gibeah or Ramah." So they passed along and went their way, and the sun set on them near Gibeah, which belongs to Benjamin. They turned aside there in order to enter and lodge in Gibeah. When they entered, they sat down in the open square of the city, for no one took them into his house to spend the night. To get an idea a little bit of where we're at, you can take a look at the map. You got Jerusalem, the the southern city. Gibeah is actually in red. All right, and so you have the tribe of Benjamin right there on your map to just give you an idea of the setting here. All the setting takes place in the tribe of Benjamin's territory, for the most part. So this second story of the appendix, remember there's 2 stories in the appendix. Chapter 17 and 18 was story 1. This is the second story. It encompasses the last 3 chapters of the book and is usually entitled the Benjamite War. Well, this took place even earlier than the previous story of Micah and Jonathan. Now, there are a few reasons why most scholars, if not really all the scholars, believe this occurred actually earlier than 17 and 18. And remember that the Hebrew writers were not worried about chronological order. That is not what their main idea here is. It's usually to link up stories. Notice how this week we have a story of, we have Ephraimite, we have Jerusalem, we have Bethlehem, right? You actually see some of the same places. So these are linked up, but they're not necessarily in chronological order. This occurred very early. So first reason. First, in Judges 20, and we're going to see this next week in more detail. I'm just going to mention them, okay? Judges 20, verses 26 through 28, the tabernacle, or at least the ark, is located in Bethel at the time. And second, Phinehas, who is the grandson of Aaron, is still alive, and he's serving at this point in time. So those two things point to a very early date. If I can imagine, Phinehas was probably around the same age as maybe Caleb, probably a little bit younger than Joshua, maybe not much younger than Joshua. So if Phinehas was still serving, okay, it was pretty early on. All right, so most have that. Now, the third reason is we see that the tribes were still able to muster together as one man. In other words, the tribes were at this point were not divided so badly as we kind of saw as we moved into the time of the Judges, right? So in the first verse of chapter 20, once again, we're going to go over that next week, all of Israel is mustered for war, all right? And that really is something that wouldn't have taken place as we gotten later in the Judges. We know that this was not the case. We moved deeper in the time of the Judges. These tribes were more and more separated. We have hundreds of years where we didn't even hear from the tribe of Judah or know what was going on in their territory. And so they were very, very divided as things went on. So when you read this, actually, besides the real gross immorality that we see, right, this section, when you start reading chapter 19, 20, and 21, it actually reads more like the book of Joshua than Judges. We're closer to Judges chapter 1 with the movement of all the tribes into their own territory. Everybody understand that? So this is very early on. So these days in verse 1, we're not long after the death of Joshua. I mean, I'll take a guess within 10 years of Joshua's death, maybe within a few years of his death. That's how early this occurred. The previous chapters took place at least 2 decades or more after the time of Joshua, but if somebody said it may have been 50 or 60 years, that's probably just as accurate. We don't know how many decades after Joshua's death that chapter 17 and 18 occurred, but more than likely, maybe it could be up to from 20 years, maybe up to 50 or 60 years. So could have been much later on. Now, they're not exact dates. I mean, they're guesses based on, looking at, a bunch of different information. But for us, this is just a means to give us a general idea of the timeline, okay? So we know where we're at. Next, the author repeats himself once again and writes, there was no king in Israel. Now, because we have spent time on this phrase, I will only mention its importance. Again, its importance as the author has kind of pointed out as the book's theme, especially the theme of the appendix. And so all these things were happening because there was no king in Israel. I mean, Joshua's strong leadership and the vacuum that was left after his death was basically felt really early on. As you can see, if these occurred within a decade of Joshua's death, he's gone and the cat's away and the mice will play. Didn't take long. And I think that's one of the points the author's making. So after this introduction, we have the introduction now to our main character of the story. He's introduced. He was a traveling Levite staying in the remote part of the hill country of Ephraim. Now, the idea here is that the communications and the caravan routes ran north-south in the territory of Ephraim. And it should be in the territory of Benjamin as well. So if you kind of look at Jerusalem and you go right down the center there, you can cut it right in half. So generally north and south, that's where the caravan routes ran. So the idea here is we don't know exactly where it was, but wherever this man's house was in Ephraim, it was off either east or west of these caravan communication routes. That's kind of what it means. I have a feeling he was up in the northeastern or western part of the tribe of Ephraim's territory, but it could be the northern and eastern part. But he was well away from these traveling caravan routes. Here we have a man who sounds really, basically, and I don't know if you got this when you're reading, he sounds a lot like Joshua. The connection that we should make between the two, that I think the author is pushing here, is that traveling and looking for work had become quite a common theme, a common thing among the Levites, as they needed to do this to survive. And on one of these trips, he went south and ended up in Bethlehem for whatever reason, to look for work like Jonathan did. While he was in Bethlehem, he took a concubine for himself, whose family home was there. This means that she was a Judean, not a Levite. Now, there is nothing in the Torah that says that a Levite cannot marry a Judean or another tribal member. There's nothing wrong, but just pointing it out that she was from the tribe of Judah, not a Levite. Now, remember also for context that a concubine was a wife, not a harlot, but a wife, but one of lesser status. See, a concubine was not a slave, was not a harlot, and had literally most of the same rights as the wife of greater status, okay? They were not mistreated and were not the same as our modern term mistress, was not a sex slave in any way. A concubine was a wife, just one of lesser status. But at some point, this man and his concubine had a major problem, and she went back to her father's house in Bethlehem. So the question is, what's the major problem? Because there is a little question about what happened here. See, even though we are not told exactly what happened, let's carefully scrutinize. I would like to carefully scrutinize, just for fun, a Hebrew phrase here in verse 2 in order to help us kind of understand the situation. The NSAB, along with a host of other translations, say that she was unfaithful to her husband. That's the key problem, right? Or, as the NASB says, played the harlot against him. Now, this indicates, if you take this, that it was beyond a doubt that she cheated on him. And the fight ensued, and he basically kicked her out. Right? Makes sense? Probably most of you, by reading your Bibles, thought that that's kind of what happened here. The Hebrew word here is zana. Now remember that the Hebrew word for harlot is zona, right? So that's a harlot, that's a noun. Zana is a verb. So some concordance have zana as zona is a harlot, zana is the verb, meaning act or acts like the harlot, acted like a harlot. So that's their thinking. There are some concordances that list this verb as meaning to act as a harlot, but others take this Hebrew word to mean to feel repugnance or anger towards. The alternative idea is that they had a huge fight and then she left. So we have two sides. Most scholars are on one or the other. So it wasn't a matter of her cheating on him, infidelity. The Greek Septuagint translate this as anger, or that she departed from him. Most of the Greek Septuagint manuscripts will read it that she just simply departed from him rather than using a Greek word that stresses unfaithfulness. You remember the reason why you can put some, you can kind of like use the Greek Septuagint, and it has some foundation in truth, is because 70 scholars put the Greek Septuagint together. So that means 70 Hebrew scholars decided together that zana did not mean that she was unfaithful, but that they were angry. There was anger involved. There was a fight. The Hebrew rabbis, the Greek, okay, good. The Greek Septuagint, right. The Hebrew rabbis generally conclude that the Levite and his concubine had an argument, and this was not a matter of sexual misconduct. Now, does it change our interpretation or anything else? Does it change the truths here? No, not really. As usual, I just want, as good Bible students, to know that there's two sides of the coin here. There's two arguments here. So the Hebrew rabbis generally believe that there was a fight here. Their reasoning is that this, on top of the language. They say that the law, right, the Torah required the execution of women who had adulterous affairs, right? So they were generally stoned. They were taken out, they were executed. Her life would have been forfeit under normal circumstances. I think that their conclusion has merit based upon the character of this Levite. So how many of you read ahead? Did anybody read ahead and read all of chapter 19? So if you did read all of chapter 19, you don't get a bad grade from me if you didn't. I'm sorry, I'm not going to put anybody on the spot. But if you read ahead, I think you would concur that the character of this Levite was not very good, right? So I think that their conclusion has merit because based on the character of this Levite. You know, how many of you think, like me, that this man was cold, selfish, and heartless? That's kind of the idea I got. Doesn't sound like a man who would have put up with somebody cheating on him. He was certainly the type of man who would have executed this woman if she truly crossed him. At least that's my opinion. I believe that she went to her father's house in Bethlehem after they had a fight. That's what I believe after my study, where she stayed for 4 months. Okay? Either way, doesn't change the text. Either way, in verse 3, it seems that he had some concern over this woman. He changed his mind. He settled down, whether it was an adulterous affair or a fight. Okay, we know how us men are sometimes, right? The fight occurred, and we're angry, and then the anger goes away a little bit, and you know, we might miss a woman, we miss their company, you know? So the original reaction is to be angry and selfish, and then after a while, we kind of calm down and we think about it. Not all men are like that. So my question about this concern is, was it selfish, possibly because of the embarrassment of the situation presented, or was it because he genuinely missed her company? And it could have been either or. Doesn't tell us why. Now, I want to talk about shame. I'm going to introduce this. I know I've talked about it before. I just want to make sure we're clear on this, because the reason why I'm going over this with you is because when you study the Old Testament, especially, and you can even see it in the New Testament, shame versus honor is a very important thing to understand. It will clear up a lot of actions and behaviors. So when I say shame, it's not feeling ashamed. Now, when you are under shame, you may feel embarrassed and you may feel ashamed. But I don't want you to think shame has anything to do with being ashamed, or like our idea of being ashamed. So shame was not feeling ashamed, but when one's social status has been diminished, usually becomes a factor in these ancient stories, as he might have wanted to win her back to remove the shame on his family. Understand where shame comes in?
The proverb you think of is a good name is rather to be chosen than fine riches.
Right.
That idea.
Right, of your name, your reputation. You know, one of the places where we see shame as a factor is the wedding at Canaan, right? So it was very, very important that they provide enough wine for that whole wedding feast and ceremony, right? And so they were going to run out of wine, so that family would have been shamed. It wasn't that they would feel ashamed. They certainly would have felt ashamed or embarrassed, but they would have lost social status. That's why when the Lord stepped in and Mary was so concerned for this family, is because it would have been a big deal. Running out of that wine, they would have been under shame rather than honor. Now, that runs really deep in the Old Testament. I'm going to talk a little bit more about it a little bit later. So I have to wonder, did he miss her? Did he miss her company? Did he care about her? Or was he feeling shame? And so one of the reasons why he went after her is because there was shame on his family until he brought her back. And usually actions like this fix the situation. He brings her back, He restores his honor once she's back home with him. I mean, that could be the case. So we're going to talk a little bit more about this. But I think it's very important that we study this because it is important in your Old Testament studies to understand that that's how this culture runs. It runs on shame and honor lots of times. So the reason is not clear, but after 4 months, he traveled all the way down to Bethlehem to win her back. He probably saddled gifts for his father-in-law and for his wife as well on the 2 donkeys. When he arrived, she brought him into her father's house, which indicates that whatever did happen, it was not irreconcilable. In other words, it seemed like she acted positively, even though these are social things that normal people do. It seems like that this wasn't beyond repair at this point. It's in good shape. So he gets invited in. She brings him in to her father's house. When her father saw her husband, it was said that he was glad to see him. This also had relation to shame, as her presence at home probably caused shame on the father's household as well. He's probably glad to see his son-in-law. I don't doubt that. But as the daughter arrived home, this father's household was probably under shame. And this was a way of repairing it, seeing his daughter goes back off with her husband. Whew. So he was glad. Probably shame had to play a part in this as well. It was very rare, yet totally dishonorable for a wife to be separated from her husband. It was very dishonorable. The ultimate shame was for this marriage to end in divorce. So that type of occurrence, a divorce, would bring great shame on the family. They would have lesser status in the eyes of their friends, family, and other people in the community. So in verse 4 through 9, we are again familiarized with Middle Eastern hospitality. It's another subject we've discussed before. The man stayed an understood amount of time, 3 days, with his father-in-law so as not to be rude. Okay, this has to do with the culture. This has to do with the hospitality. He stayed 3 days, which is a good amount of time, as to not, offend his father-in-law. Then he tried to depart. His father-in-law, as custom requires, more customs here, implores the man to stay longer. Well, he was successful in getting the Levite to stay until the afternoon of the 5th day. Then with determination, he declined to stay any longer. Now, this is where it gets very interesting. The Levite and his servant and his concubine head home, but since they left in the afternoon, probably late afternoon, they would need a place to stay for the night. So they couldn't travel very far on the first day, basically. The first city considered was Jebus. Jebus. I don't even know how to pronounce it. Jebus. I'm going to say Jebus. Jebusites. Now, you might have been surprised to learn that Jebus, which was named after the people who ruled it, called the Jebusites, which it was actually Jerusalem. We learned way back in chapter 1, verse 21, that the tribe of Benjamin never conquered the city of Jebus, but rather shared the city with the Jebusites. As a matter of fact, the city was probably still named Jebus at the time of the writing of the book of Judges. So we know that during the time of the Judges, even though Benjamin shared the city, the Jebusites held that stronghold in Jerusalem. And it wasn't taken until Joab took it for King David. So more than likely it remained called this Jebusite name and not Jerusalem until after Joab took the stronghold and David moved his capital from Hebron to Jerusalem. Then he named it Jerusalem. So we know that even though the Benjamites shared this city with the Jebusites probably ruled and reigned in this city until that stronghold was taken. They were probably the boss and the leaders of the city, not the Benjamites. So that gives you a little background here. Jebus was about 6 miles or a 2-hour walk from Bethlehem, so it was getting dark. So if they left around 2 or 3 o'clock, it's getting around 4 to 5 o'clock, right? It's about a 2-hour walk. So the man's servant suggested to stop at Jebus, to which the Levite replied, "We will not turn aside into the city of foreigners." Instead, he wanted them to travel a little farther to stay in the city that was under Israelite control. Now, we discussed in the past that there were 3 basic types of cities, and there were some in between, but 3 basic types. One that were fully conquered by Israel, like Hebron, fully conquered, the Canaanites were expelled, okay? There were ones that were partially conquered, thus shared by Israel and the Canaanites. When we went over the city of Shechem, Shechem was a city like that. Jerusalem, or Jebus, was a city like that. These cities were shared. And there were cities were ones that Israel never conquered and were under the total control of the Canaanites. So unfortunately, there were some Canaanite cities in the land. Israel never got a stronghold in those cities. Gibeah and Ramah, mentioned in verse 13, were totally under the control of Israel. Why is this important? Because we are going to see behavior that rivals the behavior of the pagan and wicked city Sodom that God destroyed over its perverseness. The author is pointing out that the city of Gibeah was made up of only the people of God. These people were not pagans. They were God's people. This was not even a mixed city where it could have been said that the Canaanites had a deep moral impact on the Israelites, and that was true. Over hundreds of years, lots of influence, especially in those mixed cities. It affects their worship. We talked about that, the syncretism that was in the land here. This was an all-Israelite city controlled by Israelites, and possibly there was very small pockets of Canaanites living near, but not really. The reason why this Levite and his concubine ended up in the city in the first place was because he wanted to avoid contact with the wicked Canaanites. Instead, thankfully, they ended up in Gibeah. So as darkness was setting in, they only made it as far as Gibeah, which was in the tribe of Benjamin's territory. Okay? Jerusalem is in the tribe of Benjamin's territory as well. So they went a little further north. You see where Gibeah is. It's in the red just above Jerusalem. So they traveled a little further. They got on pretty late. And when they arrived in the city proper, they went to the city square. Now, they probably were at the city gate for a little while, and then they ended up in the city square. Now, what would have been understood by Hebrew readers about this story is that the Levite led his group to the city square so that as residents kind of milled around or passed by, they would be offered the standard hospitality of the day, a place to stay. A hint that there is a problem with this city was in the fact that no one offered to take them in. So, hint, problem number 1. Big problem. This is a warning sign that loses something in the translation. We don't really understand this because it's not like our culture. It's so different. Because our culture is a lot different. Taking in weary travels was a sacred duty of all Israelites and Canaanites. It's Middle Eastern hospitality again. You take in weary travelers. Father Abraham himself would have offered the required hospitality and probably would have gone above and beyond. Any Middle Eastern culture, Hebrew or Canaanite, would have ensured that the Levite had a place to stay. The fact that they didn't, and they didn't get offered that, warning, warning, danger, danger here. I think we're getting a look at a hint into the character of the people of the city of Gibeah. Now, before we move on, a lot of verses, 15 verses. Does anybody have any questions, anything that I didn't cover, or any comments about the first 15 verses? Anything that wasn't clear? Is everybody good in understanding the story so far? Good. All right, let's finish. I'm going to read 16 to the end of the chapter. Follow along with me. Let's see what happens next as this story truly turns bizarre. Right? Then behold, an old man was coming out of the field from his work at evening. Now the man was from the hill country of Ephraim, and he was staying in Gibeah, but the men of the place were Benjamites. And he lifted up his eyes and saw the traveler in the open square of the city, and the old man said, "Where are you going? And where do you come from?" And he said to him, "We are passing from Bethlehem in Judah to the remote part of the hill country of Ephraim, for I am from there, and I went to Bethlehem in Judah. But I am now going to my house, and no man will take me into his house. Yet there is both straw and fodder for our donkeys, also bread and wine for me, your maidservant, and the young man who is with your servants. There is no lack of anything." In other words, we're okay. It's all good. I'm good. And the old man said, "Peace to you. Only let me take care of all your needs. However, do not spend the night in the open square." A little bit of a warning there in that phrase. That's not just a little bit of hospitality there. That is, I think, a little bit of a warning. Do not spend the night in the open square. So he took him into his house and gave the donkeys fodder, and they washed their feet and ate and drank. And while they were celebrating, behold, the men of the city, certain worthless fellows, surrounded the house, pounding the door. And they spoke to the owner of the house, the old man, saying, "Bring out the man who came into your house, that we may have relations with him." Then the man, the owner of the house, went out and said to them, "No, my fellows, please do not act so wickedly. Since this man has come into my house, do not commit this act of folly. Here is my virgin daughter and his concubine. Please let me bring them out, that you may ravish them and do to them whatever you wish. But do not commit such an act of folly against this man." But the men would not listen to him. So the man, the Levite, seized his concubine and brought her out to them, and they raped her and abused her all night until morning. Then let her go at the approach of dawn. And as the day began to dawn, the woman came and fell down at the doorway of the man's house where her master was until full daylight. And when her master arose in the morning and opened the doors of the house and went out to go his way, then behold, his concubine was lying at the doorway of the house with her hands at the threshold. And she is reaching, trying to get in the house still, with the arm outstretched. It's a grisly sight. And he said to her, "Get up and let us go." But there was no answer. Then he placed her on the donkey, and the man arose and went to his home. And when he entered his house, he took a knife and laid hold of his concubine and cut her in 12 pieces, limb by limb, and sent her throughout the territory of Israel. And it came about that all who saw it said, "Nothing like this has ever happened or have been seen from the day when the sons of Israel came up from the land of Egypt to this day. Consider it, take counsel, and speak up." So in verse 16 explains that an old man who was returning from working in the fields spotted the Levite and his group, noticing that no one had offered them hospitality. He was an Ephraimite who was not originally from Gibeah. And the old man inquires of them and asks the logical questions of, "Where are you going? Where do you come from?" The Levite is truthful with his answer. But in verse 19, he offers a sort of feigned reply that there was no need for hospitality since his group was small and self-sufficient. Now, it's easily understandable. We kind of do this all the time when we are offered something. Most of us, and not for every occasion, but we see it all the time, right? Somebody offers us something. Somebody's being real nice. What do we say? Sometimes we say, no thanks. Oh, I'm okay, right? I'm good. No need. But inside, sometimes we're thinking, I hope they insist. Yeah. Sometimes in dire situations. So, this was kind of a feigned cultural thing. Everything's okay. We're good. We got food. We got wine. We'll be good in the square. Well, the old man insisted. He did insist. And thus, we have another hint about this town. Okay? This is a hint, big hint. You see, although not as comfortable, bedding down in the town square would have been lawful and safe under most circumstances. I mean, this occurred. People who don't have a place to stay could bed down, be very, very, very safe in Israelite or Canaanite cities. And so usually it's lawful and safe under most circumstances. But this man insisted because he knew these townspeople. And staying too late in the town square was very dangerous. And so we got a hint as what's coming next. He makes sure that this man goes with him into his house, okay, because it was very dangerous. No, do not stay out here in the town square. It's getting dark. Let's go. So they loaded up. That's what happened. Next is where, and the funny thing is, the Levite came to this town for safety and to be with his people, right? Isn't it unbelievable? It's the whole reason why you're here. So next is where we see the parallel story between Lot and the two angels in Genesis 19. Everybody remember that story, right? God's going to destroy the city of Sodom. The two angels come into the city to get Lot. And as soon as those two angels are in Lot's house, the men of the city surround the city, and they want the two angels thrown out of the door so they can have sexual relations with these two angels. And they don't realize they're angels. They think they're men. They beat on the door. They threaten. Just repeat. So we see this parallel stories. The men of Gibeah, like the men of Sodom, suddenly surround this old man's house, demanding that he throw out the Levite so they can have sexual relations with him. So it's the same exact demand in Genesis 19. As a matter of fact, such a grisly, gruesome, historical story that's where we get the term sodomite, from the city of Sodom, right? A gross act of immorality, sexual immorality here. That's historical in nature. These are Hebrews. I've read this passage dozens of times, and I still can't believe this story. I still have a hard time processing this. This is a Hebrew. These are God's people. You're not shocked when you hear this of Sodom and Gomorrah. We all know the story, right? Down with them, destroy them. We hear that, the surrounding of the house. We can't wait till God sends fire and brimstone down, right? To judge these people. This is Gibeah in Israel. These are God's people. This is unbelievable. And if I'm right, this is a few years after the death of Joshua. In verse 22, it calls these men worthless fellows. Literally says sons of Belial. And this sons of Belial, it's a derogatory remark for men who commit lewd and gross immoral acts, and it's attached to idolatry as well. It's not a good term. And it says that these men pounded or defact. This Hebrew word defact, right, carries the idea that these men violently pounded on the door with increased force. That's what the Hebrew word means, defact. They were hurling themselves at the door. And we've seen that before, right? You get your whole weight behind it, trying to get a door open. Then you get a couple men, and they're all throwing their shoulder into the door. These men are pounding on the door. But they're not just making a bunch of racket. They're throwing their bodies at the door. That's what this Hebrew word carries. They're hurling themselves. They were intending to beat on the door until they gain entry. Now, knowing that he had to do something, the old man actually went out to offer his daughter and the Levite's daughter in place of the man so that these perverts could abuse the women instead. Now, I want to take a brief detour to explain the Oriental mindset. I think it's very important for this story and other stories that you may read about. The mindset is hard for us to understand because it is so foreign to our own thinking and our own culture. Very different than our culture. We just don't think about things the way they did. But what I am about to explain does not make it right or excuse any of the abominable behaviors in the passage. It's just a different culture, a different way of thinking. It's still wrong. Just like many people nowadays have the Western mindset, the Western way of thinking, and it's still wrong. So this is an Oriental mindset. Very important to kind of clear up some passages and some strange occurrences. And Judges is full of those, right? Now, it concerns three things, and we went over this. Middle Eastern hospitality, the ancient value placed on women, and I already mentioned earlier the shame versus honor mindset, where a person under shame, which is a condition, right? A condition where the people that are under shame would do just about anything to win their honor back and thus removing the shame. I mean, that's what they were striving towards. Nowhere in the Bible does it say, this is what you must do. You must wash in purified water to remove your shame. And that's how we know it's wrong, a mindset. There's nothing in the Bible that deals with shame. This is a man-made cultural thing and a mindset that has nothing to do with God and our Lord. This is just the way they thought. So these people you would do just about anything to win your honor back. That's the idea. You're always trying to win your honor back. Protecting a house guest was one of the most important aspects of Middle Eastern hospitality. There was other parts of Middle Eastern hospitality, but protecting someone under your roof was very important. As a matter of fact, there was no greater shame than a host who allowed something bad to happen to a guest under his roof. Hosts were obligated to protect their guests at all costs, even at the expense of themselves and their own family members. That's how they thought. Rather than live with the shame of letting something happen to their house guests. Note, some hold to the treachery of Jael. Remember we talked about Jael, right? In Judges 4, way back in Judges 4, lesson number 5. Jael took the tent peg, right? Sisera went into her tent. She invited him in. She takes the tent peg, boom, drives it through his temple, right? Yeah, drives it through his temple. There are people who say that she was dead wrong. Why was she wrong for doing such a thing? Because she violated one of the most sacred, important aspects of Middle Eastern hospitality. You can't invite somebody into your tent, no matter who you were killing. Invite them in and break that code, that law. And so there's people who have a very hard time with it, especially Hebrews, who look at that passage and will not give her a break. They say she was dead wrong because you can't do that to a person. Invite him into your tent and then drive a tent peg through their skull. So instead of praising Jael, she becomes a villain. It's treachery, even though the Lord willed it. You know what I'm saying? But there's some who hold to a very strict interpretation that Jael was treacherous for what she did in violating this sacred law of hospitality. If you even invited an enemy under your roof or tent, you were obligated to protect them with your life. Unfortunately, the second part of this is womanhood was lightly regarded in the ancient world. Women were treated as pawns and second-class citizens. It's a fact. But let me get one thing straight. This was not of God. Just because it occurred back in Bible times does not make it right. the law of Moses often protected women against abuse. If you look and you know the law of Moses, it was not slighted against women. It often protected them. God's law insisted that they be treated fairly and humanely at all times. Remember the daughters of Zelophehad, who were given rights of inheritance by God. The daughters of Zelophehad wanted to inherit their father's lands, their inheritance. But their father had no sons. So they went to Moses, basically said, we want to inherit our father's lands, but there's no sons. Moses went to God. God said, they're right. Give them their land. Always treated fairly. God always took care of the women. So even though they were lightly regarded during this time and some abuses, and it's hard to understand, they were always to be treated humanely. God always looked out for women. For example, Hagar, when Hagar ran away, right? It wasn't just about the boy Ishmael. It was about Hagar as well. The Lord spoke to Hagar. The Lord encouraged her. The ancient environment was often brutal. It's a fact. It is. As a matter of fact, it reminds me of me and Harry, your conversation, when you talk about all this killing and slaying, right? I think it was a conversation we were having, and I think your comment to me was, oh, it was just brutal back then. Like you almost know it's going to occur. Battles and death and swords and killing and blood, and you expect it. Because, it was brutal back then. It was barbaric. You almost came to expect it during those times. It's a fact that the ancient environment was often brutal. It's not like our kinder and gentler society. Most people probably couldn't survive back then if we transported in time. But this was not God's intention, but rather the result of sin in the fall, just like today. They're all sins. They're all wrong. So my point that I want you to get from me is that these behaviors were dictated by culture, and I want you to understand that culture. But they were not acceptable to the Lord, no matter what hospitality required. What happened here was an offense to the Lord and a tragedy. So after offering his daughter and the Levite's wife, the men were not placated. They simply refused his offer. Now, nothing else is said about the old man's daughter. I don't know if you noticed that as you were reading, right? Nothing's said of her. She somehow escaped the rape, and I think because the Levite acted quickly. If you look at verse 25 real quick again, it says, but the men would not listen. Then directly after it says, so the man seized his concubine and brought her out to them. That's the man, is not the old man. This is the Levite. And then they raped her and so on and so forth. In verse 25, he actually brought his concubine out to them. The Levite did, not the old man, right? He just shoved her out the door, and I think that it's as the old man was coming back in, thinking, what's my plan next? These men won't be placated. And as he was coming back in and the door was open, I think this Levite said, get out there, and just shoved this woman out. And thus, the young girl, the old man's daughter, wasn't out there, because by the time that concubine got out there, the men were, in a frenzy. And so they were placated at that point. So that's how I see this. In verse 25, he just shoves her out the door as the old man was coming back into the house. They took the concubine, then raped and abused her all night. And when they were done with her, she was able to make it back to the front door, then she died soon after. And like I said, she died reaching for the door. What a cold-hearted weasel this Levite is. What a coward. We see this Levite's true character as his actions were done to save his own skin. That's why he did it. It's not that he didn't love her. He just loved himself more. He's saving his own bacon. Now, at daybreak, he went outside to leave. And I asked the question, he slept that night? I wouldn't have been able to sleep. Even if I thought, boy, It would have been a long night if I got thrown out that door. I mean, I'm sure he was relieved. Did he sleep? I wouldn't have. In verse 28, he tells her to get up. I mean, can you feel the language in here? If he felt anything for her, he would have went out. It would have talked about how he opened the door and he was sorrowful, and he couldn't believe he allowed it to happen. And he picked her up tenderly and he put her. You get any of that when you read this? As a matter of fact, when he comes out, he just basically says, "Get up." He might have even said it just like I said it. He doesn't help her. He doesn't help her at all. He shows no concern for her. He simply notices that she is dead, then loads her upon the donkey and heads for home. So we're told. The story would be bad enough with just the abominable acts of these men of Gibeah, but the cold-hearted indifference of this Levite makes this one of the most infamous stories in the history of Israel. It will be the acts of these men that brought great shame on Israel. Which century later will be written about by the prophet Hosea. Now, I'm not getting into context. I just want you to read the verses. And we understand the context is to point back to this shameful behavior of the men of this city. So more context, you go back to the book of Hosea and read it. But just give you an idea of what Hosea says, these two verses. Hosea 9:9 says, "They are deeply depraved, as in the days of Gibeah. He will remember their guilt. He will punish their sins." Hosea 10:9 says, "Since the days of Gibeah, you have sinned, Israel. There they stand. Will the battle against the sons of injustice not overtake them in Gibeah?" Our chapter ends with the Levite arriving home. He took the body of his concubine and cut her up into 12 pieces. Then he sent one piece to each of the 12 tribes of Israel. You know, I've heard this expression before. Who needs daytime soaps? Or any of the many grisly shows that TV provides today? Sit down and read your Bibles. Read Judges. We don't need TV. These events are unbelievable. We've read in the book of Judges, just to name a few, tent pegs driven through skulls. We have daggers being thrust straight through people. Daughters being sacrificed on altars. Plenty to entertain you in the Old Testament, in the book of Judges itself. Now, the Hebrew word used here to describe how he cut her to pieces is natak. Now, this is a word normally used for how priests cut, or the better word than cut is divide. They divide the animal before they place them. So dividing the animals for sacrificial use. Natak is how a priest would divide the animal to place it on the altar of burnt offering. That's the big altar that's in front of the tabernacle or the temple, right? The very big altar. So the priest would divide, he would natak the animal with precision. Most of the Levites were the butchers of Israel. I don't know if any of you know that. We have goldsmith, we have blacksmith, we have tanners, we have all kinds of specialties. Well, the Levites were the butchers. They knew how to cut an animal. The ego of this man was that he may have seen this as an act of piety, or that he was acting as a high priest. He was a Levite after all. And we see that the lines are blurred. Doesn't matter whether you're from the sons of Aaron. If you're a Levite, I guess you're priestly. We're not told, but he divided it up, probably had the skill as a butcher, or that this knowledge has been passed down. He divides this woman just like he would divide an animal. Now, this was his warning to Israel and a call to action for this atrocity. And there's a part of me that understands that drastic measures were needed to get the attention of Israel. So I can understand a part of this where he had to grab the Israel's attention, shake them and wake them up, because people are not going to believe that in a city in Israel this kind of atrocity, this kind of moral depravity occurred, this kind of sexual immorality amongst God's people needed to be rooted out. Now, there was a part of that, but a part of it where I think it was the ego of the man who just thought that this was an act of piety, that he was doing the right thing. But mostly what he did is he desecrated this woman's body. It was not allowed in Israel. Now, this event may be what King Saul had in mind when he divided a yoke of oxen. Yoke of oxen is usually 2 oxen. They stand side by side. And King Saul did this in his version of calling Israel to action. He called Israel in action to deliver Jabesh, and that's found, if you want to look at it, in 1 Samuel chapter 11. Specifically, that is in verse 7. So basically, King Saul cut up some oxen, sent it throughout the territory to kind of warn them, they better come to action here. They better come to his aid. We're going to free and help Jabesh. That was his warning. Here's what I want you to notice. This tie-in, right? Notice that Saul was a Benjamite. Guess from what city? Gibeah. That's Saul's hometown, Gibeah. Right? So here's another thing I wanted to mention about Gibeah. You remember when Joshua asked for the sun to stop? Guess where that occurred? Gibeah. It occurred in Gibeah. So Joshua needed a little extra time to defeat the enemy, the Amorites, right? So the Lord stopped the sun, left it up in the sky for a little bit longer, so the day was extended, all right? So we have this wonderful history where the Lord blessed Joshua in this battle at Gibeah. And then we have Saul, the first king of Israel, coming up from Gibeah. And in between we have this dark blotch spot, this atrocity. So Gibeah has some history to it. So there's a few facts. To close, the Levites' desecration, it had its desired effects. Whether he was right or wrong by doing it, we probably would all agree he was wrong, but it had its desired effects as it was going to start intertribal war. So next week, as we study 20 and 21, we are going to, when they find out what happened in this city. And so the next couple of weeks, we are going to find out what happens. What are the repercussions of everything that happened in chapter 19? We're going to look at those things. Okay, before we close, I would like to open it up for questions. Does anybody have any questions or comments? I never know whether I'm covering the material well enough so you understand what's going on, if I answered every question that you may have had in your mind in your reading. So please, or if you had some thoughts about the characters and things, something I might have overlooked, if you have any thoughts, please, this is your time. Nothing's changed? Right, from the time of the judges? Yeah. Well, I was saying to somebody earlier, I think we were talking about it earlier, me and you, Ro, how, you know, we're not much different than the time of the judges. We're heading there in that direction, right? And we see this parallel, like in a mirror, some of the just corrupted behavior, even in our own country.
Yeah. I should say things are getting worse, going back.
Things are getting there. They're getting bad.
Just what we're doing to children, you know.
Right. Right. How many babies have we murdered? Right.
Yeah.
Any other questions over chapter 19? What, from the chapter? You never knew the story? I've read it so many times, but I never really understood it. Right. So did I make it sensible and it's understandable? Yeah. what I want to, I want you to be horrified. I want you to understand how horrifying this was, that God's own people, not long after the death of Joshua, man, early on, and I think that's the impact the author is having. You got to understand this happened very early, and already we find such abhorrent, just horrible moral behavior. It didn't take long. So,
Are you able to put a time horizon of when this occurred?
when this actual chapter occurred, I would say that the best guess is within probably 10 years of Joshua's death. So Joshua passed, and after Joshua's death, the time of the judges start. All right, so you start the clock after Joshua's death. So we're talking about within the first century of the time of the judges. So you would say within maybe 3 to 5 years. Whereas last story was early in the time of the judges. It might have been 20, could have been 50 or 60 years, but early on in the time of the judges. So the whole appendix occurred very early, which is why in the beginning we were talking about timeline and we were talking about putting things in chronological order was not important. These 5 chapters were stuck here, and you can see how it's almost shocking what we're reading. That's why the author did it. He's showing, you'll read and say, and you can read a lot of stuff out there. You go and you can Google, what was the purpose of the appendix of the judges? And lots of times it's really to show, life during the time of the judges. Well, if you wanted to understand life during the time of judges, you could go to archaeology sites and study pottery, and look at the different, artifacts. You want to study the life during the time of the judges, you can certainly do that by studying archaeology, right? So I go beyond that. The reason why these 5 chapters are written is not just to understand, or have a view into life at the time of the judges. It was to show the moral corruption that had already occurred not long after the death of Joshua and how bad it had gotten. And these are just 2 stories, 5 chapters, 2 stories. Ro.
I find it kind of ironic that he's worried about shame, but yet it was acceptable to marry a concubine?
It was.
But there was no shame with that?
Not in the culture. It was a lesser wife.
And yet they would stone a woman if she committed adultery. It just doesn't make sense to me.
Right.
It's like all convoluted, I guess.
Right. We can only, when I say let's try to understand, I mean, we can only understand a small portion of it. We'd have to be from one of the tribes and live during the time of the judges to really, truly understand, you know what I mean, but we can get a little picture. Not a lot of it's understanding. It's understandable, like our Western thinking and the way things are now are so vastly different, it's hard to even imagine what they were thinking. But it was the culture of the time. So I want you, as good Bible students, is to understand that ancient culture, even if it's just surfacey, so that there's not vast confusion about what's going on. If you just keep in mind when you read the Old Testament, you use it when you read 1 Samuel, you use it when you read Genesis, no matter what Old Testament book, and even New Testament, the wedding of Cana. If you understand shame and you understand honor, then it'll help you understand kind of the motivations, at least. Not that they were right or wrong, just their motivations. Why were they doing what they were doing? Why were they saying? Why were they going to battle? Why did that person have to die? Because he had to kill that person in order to get their honor back. And there's lots of instances in the Old Testament too. Lots of times to get your honor back, you had to kill somebody. That's why the city of refuge was there. You had to kill that person. That's why that person had the city of refuge to run to, even if it was accidental, to win back the family honor. And we see, lots of stories like that. So the kind of customs and cultures that went on at this time are very important. It'll help you understand a lot of the books of the Bible, especially the Old Testament.
I think it also highlights the grace and mercy that came with Jesus Christ. And
Right.
he made in culture and everything.
Right. We don't see that much. And I think you're right. If you do look through history, it is the influence of the New Testament, you know, and the Lord and how he showed us the way, right? Softening a lot of these things up, right?
And remember the beginning where it said there was no king in Israel. That's another thing. This is what happened.
Right. The theme of the book, I would argue, as we wrap up, is there was no king in Israel. Right? That was a problem. And we talked about that. But it's really, we have to have the right amount, the right king. So it's not any king. It's not that there was no king. It's that we all need the Lord leading us. And they needed the Lord. They needed the true king. And King David came close. He was the example. He was the start, but he was pointing to the ultimate king, right?
Engage in, I guess, the Eastern culture with the Muslims, go away from your Islam faith. I mean, even in their own family, they have the right to kill their daughter or anything like that. You know what I mean? It's like their culture.
Yeah. The Arab culture, those cultures, they're all shame. That's all shame and honor. We see a lot of it. I don't know. My mom used to watch Shogun. Well, why do they put the sword? I don't even understand that. I mean, it's hard to understand, right? When they lose a battle, boo-hoo. You know, give the other team, learn to fight another day. You know, give the person their props, their victory, and then you can be the general and lead the army in the next fight, right? But then they all want to kill themselves. It's because they were under shame. So the Japanese culture is a shame and honor system. So if they lost a battle, the shame was so great that no death, no battle, no victory can remove the shame, so you just kill yourself because there is no removing the shame. Anybody from a shame, honor culture, if you cannot remove the shame in any way, you just kill yourself.
Isn't that what King Saul did in battle? Right? Didn't he say?
Well,
His sword bearer, he asked the sword bearer to kill him.
that's right, but yes.
Rather than killed by, then,
It might have, yeah, and I think
so
that,
he didn't want to be killed by his enemy, right?
right, you don't allow the enemy to kill you. But I think that they thought they were going to make him a plaything a little bit, so it might have involved a little bit of torture at the end of his life, and he just didn't want to be made an example of, and so, yeah. But part of it is, too, I mean, if they catch him, they catch a king, they usually string him up, right? And then that's shame. Even though you're dead, yeah, you're still worried about your own shame. So, yeah, good catch. I think that's part of it. Yeah. And so I think that if we apply it and we know it, you can start reading whatever. You're reading 1 Samuel. Oh, you know what? I think that has a lot to do with shame and honor. And you see why they're doing what they're doing. Good. All right, let's close in prayer. Great job again tonight, everybody. Sorry I kept you almost to 8:30. But this has been a wonderful study, and I hope that tonight was a blessing. We understood chapter 19 pretty well and what went on here. Dear Heavenly Father, just thank you for your word. You know, tonight was hard to pull out applications from this text. A lot of heartbreaking things occurred to people. Just hard things to imagine them going through, hard things to imagine from your people, from God's people, your own people, called by your name, acting and behaving this way. It's just hard to understand. But Lord, I just pray that the blessing from this chapter and from the rest of the book stays with us throughout the week, Lord, and just continue to honor the commitment of everyone here and everyone at home as they come out every Thursday to learn about the book of Judges and to learn about you, Lord. And I just pray that that'll bear fruit in their lives and they'll just bring this with them during the week and just carry with them these truths and what applications that we can draw from these chapters. So we'll use them in our life, Lord. So just thank you for everyone that came out tonight. Thank you for everyone who is home. Bless each as they go and drive home. Keep them safe on the road. And thank you again for this study.